Ready to roll? Shut off your gizmos. Zach. All right. So we kind of really get started with, I think, what most economists would call macroeconomics today. So we're going to kind of build up a story starting from microeconomic foundations. So part of the reason that we went through Tom and Jen and thinking about maybe our little economy begins with them, maybe it begins with Adam and Eve. Maybe we got some trading going on there, right, at the beginning of time. Maybe that's our economy, and they crank out a few kids, and the population starts to grow, and we have some trading going on there. So how do we get into this situation where we've got 300 million people running around our island, and how do we measure their activity? So what I like to start off with is analyzing the individual and seeing how that works up into the whole economy and thinking about everybody's behavior. All right, so the sources of funds and uses of funds. I kind of want to take a page out of personal finance and think about how you budget yourself. In other words, what are your sources of funds and then uses of funds? So for an individual, sources of funds equals uses of funds. Remember when we had the old imports equal exports business? What I sell to you is what you bought from me. This is kind of the same thing going on here. In order for me to do something with my money, I had to have gotten money from someplace. So, what are the sources of funds for you guys as an individual? What are ways that you get money? Income from doing what? Work, from wages. Okay, so one of your sources is productive labor. So productive labor wages, right? Okay, so you get a job. That's kind of the good old-fashioned American way. How else do you get money? Gifts. So grandma gives you money. What else do you guys do to get money? Somebody else. Thank you, though. Chris? Well, how else do we get money? Now it's getting tougher. Chris got the initial two. Maybe it's inheritance. Probably fall into the giving gifts thing. Loans. Yeah, that's a big one, right? How many people are taking out some loans to be here today? Nice show of hands. Okay. So borrowing. Borrowing is another way we did it. And then investing, investing is kind of is more of a use of fund than it is a source of funds. So we got to be careful when how did you get that? Well, if you had previous savings and you got a interest payment from it, then we might be talking about having some flow that way, which would fall more into this wage category. And also when we get into the borrowing. But I heard somebody say, grants would fall under the gifts. So yeah, we got gifts, grants, selling an asset. Yeah, I heard somebody say that. Selling an asset. So if you have a car, computer, the shirt on your back, right, you can have a garage sale and generate some funds that way. All right, so these are all ways that we can generate funds as an individual. So not number, I want to jump to the uses of funds. So this is usually easier to come up with. What are some uses of funds? buying stuff, right? So one thing is buying new goods and services. We buy things. Giving, good. So opposite of receiving, we give it away. So give it away. So we're going to start to use this word more and more, a transfer, which is kind of, we could throw onto this one is where we're ultimately going with this. So we got buying new goods and services, transfers, loaning, yes. So we can lend our money, so loan it out. And then I kind of tried to emphasize new goods and services.
Buying assets.
Existing assets, right? So buying stuff off of Craigslist is likely an existing asset, not necessarily, but usually an existing asset. So purchasing, buying existing, not rather than new.
Is it like paying bills?
So kind of used assets. Buying new stuff. Bills like your electric bill would fall up into new goods and services. We're buying new electricity, we're buying new gas. Okay, so do you think anything's missing off of here of how you get funds, sources or uses, other ways that you obtain funds? Taxes and grants, right? So if you get taxed, what are you doing? Large part of what you're doing, you guys might not know this, but we'll talk about it later, about 70 cents of every dollar that you give to the federal government goes to somebody over here as a gift. So it's a transfer payment. So these gifts are going to fall into transfer. How else can you get money? How does Bernie Madoff make money? Anybody know the Bernie Madoff story? Ponzi scheme? Scam. So stealing is kind of a popular way that can land you in jail. Economists would throw that into the transfer business again, right? So whether the transfer is voluntary or involuntary in the case of stealing. Taxes, are they voluntary or involuntary? Definitely involuntary. You know, some people might want to throw them in once in a while, but you're right. That is, the point is it's set by somebody else, what tax rate you're going to have to pay the government. And so those are involuntary transfers. Okay, so the purpose of this exercise is to think about, is it possible for an individual to have uses that exceed their income? Is it possible for an individual to spend more than the income that they have? Yes. Now, let's take a step back at the macro picture. If you guys received a gift from grandma to come to college, grandma gave it to you. If grandma cut a check for $1,000, if we look at the grand scheme of things on our island, if I step back and think about the macro picture of what went on my island in terms of scarce resources and products, goods and services, did anything change from God's viewpoint looking down at the island? No. It went from grandma to you, and then you ultimately played Ottawa University, but it went from a human being to another human being, so nothing new was created from the shell game that goes on in terms of transfers. So number 2 kind of cancels out with this number 2, because what I gave to you is what you got from me, and so from a macro perspective, there was a redistribution, but there was nothing new created. There was nothing new created. How about borrowing? Those of you with student loans. Was anything new created from the God viewpoint again? No. Kind of looks like the transfer, except this person's expected to pay it back with some interest, right? So we got kind of the same thing going on as far as from one person to the next, we had the $1,000, whether it's borrowed or whether it's given, just transferring from one person to the next, nothing new is created. So number 3 kind of connects with number 3 and doesn't really add anything from the macro viewpoint of the economy. And then finally, buying a 1971 Chevelle SS, 354 barrel 4-speed, did that change anything on the island from the God viewpoint again? No. The car, here's our little car here, the car, there's the 71 Chevelle SS. The island doesn't have another car. There was nothing new created. There was no wealth creation. It was simply transferred from one person to the next. So number 4 kind of cancels with number 4. And what we're left with is a very important concept in macroeconomics, and that is that income, from the macro perspective, the income that people earn is exactly equal to the purchases of new goods and services. Only new goods and services. So from a macro perspective, if we add up everybody's paychecks, all of the income that the nation earns, which by the way gets up to about $15 trillion, depending on how you're counting, we'll get into that later too. But let's just call it $15 trillion, adding up everybody's paycheck, that turns out to be equal from the macro perspective of all the new stuff that was created, new goods and services. Okay? That's an important concept here, is that income equals spending on new goods and services in the big picture. So, for the macro economy, income equals spending on new goods and services. This equation is not necessarily true for the individual, like you guys. You can have income that's less than your spending through these other mechanisms. So for the macroeconomy, we have that. Note, not true for any one individual. You guys spend more than you earn all the time. All right, so if you've, I suggested that you print these off. So I'm just going to reference them once in a while, just to kind of give us a flyby of the economy. I'll put it up on the screen here. Oops, oh crap, did I just do it? So this is a bit of a review from what you had in really chapter 2 and what we covered early on. Our economic problem is trying to satisfy unlimited wants with limited resources. So the economy is really about the population of people, and the economic problem is that we only have a certain amount of land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. What I'd like you to think about is that being a bucket. If I froze time right now, we could add up the amount of land, labor, machines, capital, entrepreneurship. We could kind of conceptually think, okay, what do we got to work with? The production possibilities frontier showed us the maximum combination of two goods an economy could produce given its available resources and technology. Right? So there's our stock of resources at a point in time. We have a certain knowledge base, and now we're trying to make people happy as possible. I think I'll skip to this one first. And entrepreneurs pool those resources together to make the things that we like. These are the final goods and services, the brand new pizzas that we buy on Main Street, our shirts, basketballs, whatever that is. There's a physical production process going on. We kind of want to, at times, divorce ourselves from the money aspect and think about what the engine of the economy is all about. There's kind of this magical process that goes on that we take stuff that we don't really care about for its own value. Sometimes we do. We like to go out for a walk and enjoy the land and the air and the rain or the sun or whatever. But we are concerned with what those things help us make. And so we think about the production function, the production of final goods and services. And that's the economic problem, day in and day out. How do we take society's scarce resources and transform them into stuff that helps serve society, the final goods and services? So, especially in macro class, maybe even more than micro, economists focus in on the transformation of these resources over time. And so we have this stock flow concept that's real important that I think the bucket theory helps motivate. And so with our scarce resources, if we think about the capital bucket being the stock of machines at a point in time, over the course of a year, so this 2015 year, companies are going to do what economists call investment. Purchases of brand new computers, new additions onto their buildings, right? Purchases of new capital, brand new stuff, economists call investment. That investment is a flow variable that, holding all of the things constant, would cause the bucket level to rise. We'll have, at the end of the year, more machines, more computers, more buildings. There's a hole in our bucket, though, and that hole is what we call depreciation. So as we go through the year, some things wear out, some things become maybe obsolete, that they're just kind of worthless now if we're on a MS-DOS computer program and it's just not really getting us to where we need to be, right? So we have depreciation of those machines. The balance of the inflow and the outflow determines what our bucket level is in 2015, what our next level is. So from the stock flow concept, capital is the stock of machines at a point in time. Investment and depreciation are flow variables over a period of time. So that's a little froggy. Let me give you an example that some of you in micro may remember, and I think I've used it in other classes as well. So if I told you that I make $117,000, do you think I'm doing pretty good? Am I poor? Am I doing all right? Am I rich? So not really rich, not really poor, maybe I'm middle class, 117,000. Now what if I told you I made 117,000 over the last 10 years? What if I told you I make $117,000 last month? Did I just go from poverty to super rich, making $1 million a year pretty fast, like with a few utterances of a few words? So income is a flow variable. Did that 117,000, now that I've told you it, did I say per year, per 10 years, per month? I just said 117,000. Your guys' gut feeling, I kind of tricked you, is that you automatically assumed I was talking per year, but I didn't say that. You internalized that yourself, right? Because that's kind of normal for us to think that way. So the point is that income only has meaning when there's a time period associated with it. You have to say 117,000 per year, per month, per 10 years for the variable income to have meaning. Now, let me flip that around. If I told you I've got $117,000 in my checking account, and I'm taking the whole class up to the Power and Light District tonight, and we're not coming home until it's gone, does that have meaning to you? The checking balance of 117,000. Does that have meaning? Like, can you feel like what's going to go on tonight? Are we going to have a fun time tonight? Yeah, you're darn right. If I empty out that account, we're going to be eating and drinking and being merry, right? So 117,000 is going to get us a nice big truckload of Hummers, extended Hummers with heading up to Kansas City and all kinds of things we're going to do with 117,000. The variable 117,000 is a stock variable. The checking account balance. The amount of money that I have in my checking account, $117,000, is a stock variable. It has meaning today. If I tell you I've got $117,000 in my checking account, it instantly has meaning. I don't have to say per year. In fact, per year and whatever doesn't even apply, right? So all of these variables can be done that way. And so we're going to see the relationship between stock variables and flow variables. And so throughout the semester, you might want to reference back to this chart to remind yourself this is 2.2 on stocks and flows about how that works. Okay, any questions or comments there? All right, so we talked about figuring out what we need to do. And our Tom and Jen exercise told us that if we specialize in what we're good at and trade for what we're not good at, not only will it make you better off, but it'll make others better off. Trade is a win-win deal. To engage in the market system where voluntary parties are doing freely what they want. They weren't coerced by the government or their parents because mom and dad told me to get a job or whatever. If we have a voluntary system where people are going to work and specializing in what they're good at and then trading for things they're not good at, we have a win-win situation. And so how that Tom and Jen on the island manifests itself in a population of an island of 300 million, over time it's evolved into the formation of firms and businesses. Because that's what we're doing, right? That's what you guys are doing here in class, is that you're learning something new so that you can bring something to the marketplace, and hopefully you're pursuing what you're good at, what you're passionate about, things that naturally are good for you, that you can then trade for stuff that you're not as good at doing. Well, there's other people that are like you and have similar objectives, perhaps. Maybe it's just different job roles. That collection of people, we're thinking of it as the firms or the businesses. So that's specialization in terms of Adam Smith's 1776, The Wealth of Nations. That's how it scales itself up. Those people that are the businesses also go home at night. So we don't want to lose sight that the real economy is here. Society is everybody, whether you work or you don't work for whatever reason. We've got little babies and kids, we've got old people, and then we've got people in what we're going to later call the labor force. Turns out about half of the Americans, a little over half, are in the labor force. They're willing and able to work. And so those are our blue people. And so during an 8-hour day or whatever, how many hours they work during the year, they kind of come over to this side, but at the end of the day, they come back here. So we kind of want to think about the households being the real economy that we're concerned about as economists, and then the businesses helping facilitate people trying to pursue happiness, right? Right back to our founding fathers' idea of the pursuit of happiness. How do they do that? Well, the market system is one way that can help people pursue their happiness in a free type of unrestricted way. Okay, questions or comments on that? There's the market system. We talked about it with fish and coconuts with Jen and Tom. And now we're taking a macro look at it. And up top we have the goods market. So this is the market for final goods and services, which we started off by saying is pretty darn important. So this is the market we're all used to. We go to Applebee's for dinner. We go to Walmart to buy some stuff. And so we spend money at Walmart, and Walmart gives us goods and services, right? We get to take the stuff out of their store as long as we pass through the checkout line in a proper way and don't get escorted out in handcuffs. So that's the market system up here. The other market that kind of gets less attention as we grow up because we're so used to just going and buying stuff at retail stores is this one. There's another market for resources. The households own all factors of production. Land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, the four biggies that we talked about, all make their way back to a human being in some way, shape, or form. Some of you might be thinking, well, you know, the world's ran by these big corporations. There's just a handful of people that control everything. Well, there might be true that there is some institutions of business that control some of that, but ultimately those corporations are owned by who? Stockholders, right? So eventually we can work our way back to human beings again. And so economics is really the study of human beings over here in households and their interactions in the pursuit of happiness. And so even those corporations, we can give a fractional share of the resources that they control can be tracked back to the stockholders. They're really the owners, and ultimately they can make decisions to change the direction of the corporation and how they're using up these scarce resources. If they need to lay off half of their labor force or whatever, they're going to make those decisions. Those all tie back to a human being. So households provide scarce resources. The scarce resources are paid for with wages, rents, interest, profits, all of the types of income that we have for the resources that are provided. So that's it. That's our basic marketplace, the resource market and the output market. The thing that is important to look at from an economist perspective is to not get lost in the dollars. What's really going on in the market economy is this amazing transformation. This shows up as red in your pictures. Remember, this is on My Econ Lab. The button that says buckets and circular flows is where this is at. So land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship are transformed into beer and chicken wings and pizza, right? We get this amazing transformation over the course of a day, over the course of a week, over the course of a month, over the course of the year. This transformation of resources into final goods and services. Now, what we just learned on the board that we walked through was another important concept. The spending on final goods and services in dollars, because of the trades that are going on here, are equal to the payments to the resources. Income equals spending. That's it. That's our system. Okay, questions or comments on that? This is our big flyby. All right. Let's see. Do I want to enter the government yet? Sure. We'll stop here after we get through the government. Enter the government. So in a free market, maybe there's no government. Well, obviously people formed a government for good reasons, to have property rights and transferability of resources, and so that we minimize on the stealing and the crooks and have good laws on the books. All of that stuff are good reasons that we need a government to help facilitate that trade at a minimum. So how does that disrupt the flow that we had before? Well, upstairs at the cash register, the government takes a little bit of T2. What is T2? What is the money that's funneling off here to the White House that's not going to the business completely, but the consumer spent $100, and now we got this little diversion. Taxes. What kind of taxes? Sales tax, right? So in Kansas, how much are we paying? It varies from state to state, by the way. We're a little high actually in Kansas compared to what I'm used to. It was 7% in Iowa. 8.9. It actually varies depending on municipalities and stuff too, but close to 9%. I think they keep it just under 9 for mental purposes, so that we don't, have a revolution or something. But anyway, it's around 8.9 in Kansas. All right, so all of the dollars that you spend do not go to the company now. Part of that gets diverted to the White House. Now, how else do funds get diverted to the White House? You guys are familiar with this. What kind of tax? What other kind of tax? Income, right? So your paycheck, if you made $100 at your work, you didn't get $100 over here, right? Part of that got diverted. What I'm calling T1 is the income tax coming into the White House. Because there's only 2 places to siphon off of, those are the only 2 sources of taxation. Off income in the resource market or off of sales in the final goods market. So those are our 2 sources of taxation. What does the government do with their money? Well, they got to buy toilet paper for the White House. Obama has bodily functions just like everybody else. Where do they buy their toilet paper from?
More money.
Does the government make it? Do they have their own factory of toilet paper making? They run to Walmart too. I don't know if they actually use Walmart. Maybe it's Target, some other place. But the government goes to the market just like you do. So one form of spending is what I call G1. The government is spending money in the final goods market, buying from places like Walmart or Target or Guns R Us for weapons of mass destruction, whatever the case is. They're entering the market and purchasing that stuff themselves. Another form of spending occurs in the resource market. So G2 is the government purchasing directly resources. The easy one is labor, right? We have people who work for the government. We have elected officials, but then we have what we call bureaucrats, people who just work for the government. They got to get that cush government job, as maybe you've sometimes heard, although I don't think it's always so cush. There's been some uncertainty with government jobs once in a while. So they're going to spend money on resources. Sometimes the government does produce their own thing, whatever that is. And so they're just using resources. So some of these resources do not all end up at businesses. They get siphoned off towards the White House. Okay, so it's kind of good to keep track of those flows of where they're coming from. And then finally, we talked about gifts. And 70 cents out of every dollar is this G3, what I kind of sometimes call Robin Hood theory. Take from the rich, give to the poor, right? A transfer. So G3 are transfers of dollars. Some of the dollars they collect from consumption tax or income tax can just be moving things around. Take from the rich, give to the poor. Take from the employed, give to the unemployed. Take from the young, give to the old. Another big, what do we call that one? Take from the young, give to the old. Social Security, right? That's our Social Security number. There's not a big 401k investment thing with Social Security dollars. It's really, and always has been, by the way. It's not like this is some sort of conspiracy theory. From day one, Social Security was based upon the premise of take from the young, give to the old. When the young person becomes old, we keep doing that, and we can just keep cycling the dollars. Okay? Yeah, we'll talk more. I'm going to leave it at that for now, because we'll spend a whole chapter 13, by the way, at the end of our time together, talking a little bit more about Social Security. All right, so that's kind of the lay of the land. Any questions there? Comments? All right, so we need to get into measuring these final goods and services. We've learned that you can do it through adding up everybody's income or adding up all of the spending. So there's 2 approaches that we cover in chapter 4 on measuring what we refer to as gross domestic product. GDP. Maybe a term you've heard about, but had no clue what it was. That's part of what this class is, because once you've heard it, and if you listen to just about any newscast, it's likely that the term GDP is going to be thrown at you. So it's an important one to know. So gross domestic product. Let me write that out first. Gross domestic product. GDP. GDP is the dollar value of all final goods and services produced within a nation's boundaries over the year. I'll put parentheses, or some time period. Usually, especially in this class, we'll think about annual terms. The dollar value of all final goods and services produced within a nation's boundaries over the year, or some time frame. So, questions on that definition? I think there's some interesting things that are mixed into that. Dollar value of all final goods and services. Yeah?
It's all about what's produced, not what's sold.
Okay, it's all about what's produced, not sold. Good question. So, do we do the final tally, or do we count the unsold stuff too? So yeah, we'll get into that a little bit more here. If the final good's been produced but not sold, we're kind of getting into the idea of inventories, right? So we've got them sitting on the shelf at Walmart. In our big grand scheme of things, have all the resources been used at that point? Pretty much, right? I mean, we could maybe tell a story of some little extra thing about a service tied in with it, but if the good is finished and sitting on the shelf, then all of the things that went into the production of this marker has been used. So that's why we want to account for things that were produced and not just sold. Although we look at both, by the way. So that was good comment. What about the dollar value? Why do we got the dollar value of these things? Why not just look at the quantities? Like if we did 50 cases of markers, 12 erasers, and 7 bottles of water. So 7 plus 12 plus 50, 69. So why isn't the value of the economy 69?
Because the money's already been spent.
Okay, money's been spent, yes, but I think there's something underlying more important.
You have to have the measuring device.
Okay, the measuring device. So what does the dollars do for us? Instead of saying, so the economy is worth 69, right? GDP is 69. Not in any sexual way, but just happens to be 69 this year.
Could require more resources to create one than the others.
Okay, so what does the dollar do though? If we start to put price tags on this, why is it important to have the dollar value of final goods and services? So if we put a dollar value, maybe the eraser's $2, the water's $5, and the markers are $10.
More resources are going into the markers.
Okay, yeah, it reflects the value of the resources that went into it. How about the value to the consumer? It reflects that too, right? And the amount of resources, the amount of money that they're willing to devote to that particular product. So the dollar value gives us a better reflection. You've heard of the old adage, you can't add apples and oranges? Well, that's kind of what we're doing here, right? It doesn't make sense. If we did it that way, we're saying that markers, water, and erasers all give me equal value. So if I'm at 69 and I go to 79, I'm better off. That means you're better off whether you got 10 more erasers, 10 more water, or 10 more markers, right? We're kind of putting equal price, equal value on all the goods in the economy. And so the dollar value is important in capturing the value to the households again of all these final goods and services. So that if we have a doubling of erasers, but erasers aren't that meaningful to society, GDP doesn't go up by that much, right? So that's important to be able to add them together so that we're not adding apples and oranges. Produced within the nation's boundaries. What's going on there? Within a nation's boundaries, I mean, we just got out of international trade, where we talked about going across boundaries with trade, so that seems to be excluding something. So, by saying the production occurred within the nation's boundaries, what sort of companies are we including in the calculation? Give me a company that would be included. Give me a foreign company that would be included. Toyota. Does Toyota make Toyotas in the United States? Yes. Where? Does anybody know that?
Houston,
California for sure. I know that one. And Kentucky. There very well might be Houston. There might be a number of plants. But I'm familiar with the Kentucky and the California one. We're going to include Toyota's production in the United States measurement of value or welfare, how happy we are. Because if GDP goes up, we're thinking that that's a good thing. But if GDP went up because we made a whole bunch more Toyotas, is that necessarily a good thing if all the profits are trucking off to Japan? So why are we concerned about measuring the value of production of things produced within our boundaries, regardless of whether Toyota made them or whether Ford made them? Why are we interested in, let me pick out a number here. What's a Toyota Prius running, I guess, for 30,000? 36? Okay, so we got a $36,000 Prius that was made in California. Why are we going to include the Prius in our gross domestic product?
And it's still that bucket flow. I mean, it's still, the resources are still
Good.
through the same.
All right, so connecting the Prius back to the resources, right? If we used American workers and some American materials, so a large part of that Prius was made using American resources. And so we're just going to track where the production took place to try to better estimate the value to Americans that way. As you'll read about in this chapter, prior to I think it was changed in the 1970s, we measured gross national product. GNP was another measurement that we had. And that was the dollar value of all final goods and services produced by Americans, basically is the abbreviated way of thinking about it. So then we included the value of the Ford that was produced in Germany was included in GNP, because that's income for the people who own Ford. Those profits come back. That's income for them, right? So there's some accounting exercises that aren't too difficult. Sometimes it's a little mind-numbing of showing how GNP and GDP relate to each other. And all we're doing is some subtractions of that account. We're going to take Toyota's money and make some adjustments, and the money that Ford made from Germany, we're going to make some adjustments, and we're going to end up with this measure for economic activity. Okay, and then finally, over the course of a year, dollar value of all final goods and services produced over the year. Is this a stock variable or a flow variable? Little quick quiz for you on what we just went through. Is that the stock or the flow?
Stock.
I hear a stock. How many people say stock? Raise your hand. How many people say flow? Raise your hand. How many people are clueless? Raise your hand. Okay. Well, at least you're up there. Now you need to get clued in, so you might want to go back to the video here and watch some of that. But income. I make $117,000. Does that variable have meaning to you the way I just said it? No. You got to say, Russ, well, what do you mean? 117,000 per year, per month, per day? That'd be really rich, right? Per day, per 10 years. So this variable doesn't have any meaning unless a time frame is associated with it, which makes it a flow. It's a flow variable. So this is GDP is our income. So from the exercise we did, since we're adding up the dollar value of all final goods and services, this can be shown to equal national income. So, is it proper to measure the nation's well-being? So I'm going to use the word welfare. I don't want you to immediately start thinking food stamps and unemployment line when I say the word welfare. So national welfare, national well-being. Is it appropriate to measure the nation's welfare or well-being with this statistic? What do you think? This is kind of a philosophical deal now. So if the US GDP is $15 trillion in 2015, and it rises to 15.5 trillion in 2016, are things better in the United States? Exactly, that's kind of what I want to talk about. So what do I mean by better? Economists, and when we look at the economy, the macroeconomy, this is going to be seen to be a positive thing. We have more production. The dollar value of all final goods and services produced within the nation's years over the boundary went up. And that's going to be said to be good. So I'm trying to push you a little bit to say, is that fair to measure society's well-being with income? So it's kind of like saying, does more income make us more happy? I hear some yeses.
Depends on what's produced. I'm not happy if you make more money.
You're not happy if I make more money. Okay, so that's a good clarifying point to make, is if one person has all the money, it's possible that GDP could go up. Most people, 90% of the population went down, but 10% of the population went up, causing GDP to go up. Okay, so if we're measuring welfare on a per head basis, then some of them had lower income. Now what Chris might be bringing up, tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth, is what about if 90% of the population grew by 1%, but the 10% of the population grew by 10%? In other words, everybody won, everybody got more income. Is that good? Yes? I think that's probably an indicator that things were good. Others may argue, if you guys have heard of income inequality being an issue, that it's not fair that 10% of the people are getting way richer and The 90% aren't, and so we're having this growing inequality. I'm not going to spend too much time on this topic, but you've probably heard about it in other classes, and so it's something that I'm more than happy to get into later as we get into learning some of the parameters. We kind of want to first learn the nuts and bolts so that we can have a richer dialogue. A lot of that talk is kind of smack talk, I'd call it, where people are talking that don't know what you guys are going to learn now, so that you can have a deeper, more meaningful discussion about some of those issues once you understand some of those connections. So we'll just leave it at that. I'm telling you right now that the calculation of GDP is simply this. This goes up, this is perceived to be better. Although we can maybe argue that society's well-being might not be best reflected in just GDP. So economists have spent quite a bit of time developing other measures. That's what we do. We don't just measure dollars and cents. I think sometimes economists wrongfully get coined into the accountant mode, where we're just measuring finance. Finance is an interesting subsection. We have Dr. Moore here on campus that maybe some of you have had for financial administration. The discipline of finance is kind of a subset of economics, specialized to kind of number crunching. Same thing with accounting. I think, well, in my humble opinion, everything falls under the umbrella of economics. The study of trying to satisfy unlimited wants with limited resources, I can tie that into just about any discipline. And economists do, by the way. So we study all kinds of social things, things that don't have easy dollar values. That's kind of the art form of economics, is that we try to estimate, well, what's the trade-off if we are having people that are feeling that this is wrong, even though GDP went up, but there's kind of these bad feelings that some people are poorer than other people. So we can estimate that. We can have a meaningful discussion about that. Okay. So let's write some of this down here. What's wrong with measuring society's welfare or well-being? What's wrong with measuring society's welfare, parentheses, well-being, / happiness, if you want to get down to some new things that economists are starting to create indices for. This gets into a dicey area, though, because we're not, how do you measure somebody's happiness? Are you happier than this year than last year? Are you happier than this year than last year? Are you happier? How do we add that up? Well, believe it or not, we attempt to. There's some things that we can do to subjective welfare measures, subjective happiness. But so what's wrong with measuring society's welfare with gross domestic product? Okay, so so number one, things are left out. So think about what we're measuring. The dollar value of all final goods and services, Walmart, Applebee's, blah, blah, blah. What sort of economic activity is left out of that $15 trillion?
Mowing your own lawn.
Mowing your own lawn, right? So if you go out and mow your own lawn, wash your own clothes, right? Clean your own house, you are not contributing to GDP. Shame on you. The economy would be much better if you just hired those services out. Right? You go and hire out a maid service, a lawn mowing service, dishwashing service, or whatever else I said. If you go and hire that stuff out, and those guys legally keep track of it, not this $20 softie for the 13-year-old kid that lives next door, but if you're actually hiring a lawn mowing service and they file their tax returns, you just had GDP go up. because of that, right? So GDP misses out on what we call non-market activity. In the most generic terms, non-market activity. So housework, mowing lawns, shoveling snow. Luckily we don't have any of that to do. It also misses out on charity work. Charity, I should say volunteering. If the charity is not cutting you a paycheck at the end, if you go serve food in the soup line, right? That doesn't show up in GDP somehow. Is society better off because you went and volunteered your time? Yeah, probably. I think we'd mostly argue that that's true. Missing out on the housework, the shoveling, is that real activity? Is that economic activity? Yeah, you had trade-offs, you just didn't get a paycheck for it. And so GDP is undervalued or overvalued relative to the real economic activity going on in the nation. It's undervalued, right? It's too low. We're doing a lot more than 15 trillion because GDP is missing out on some of that stuff. What else is it missing out on?
Illegal transactions.
Illegal, yes. So one would be, let me put a 1 on this, or an A, or I'll put a 1. So illegal activity. The underground economy. It's missing out on all that. Drug dealers need to wipe their butt too. They go trucking off to Walmart and buy toilet paper. So they enter back into the economy in some ways, but we've got this extra underground economy that's not filing tax returns, not putting their stuff in there. That is what economists would call real economic activity, and that is also being overlooked. Question? Yeah. No? So, what happened in Colorado? Hot legalization. What happened to GDP in Colorado? So, that's kind of weird, right? So, all of a sudden, we have GDP getting higher. Is Colorado happier? Okay, that might be arguable. What their long-term happiness is going to be, I don't know, maybe short-term happiness. Maybe it's led to a few munchies or something, a little extra activity on Doritos and Mountain Dew or something, I don't know. But is it capturing, is GDP, the fact that it's going up, capturing a positive thing for the economy? That's a question mark when we start to just simply legalize an activity. And if it was going on already, does making it legal all of a sudden make society happier? Well, society might be the same. If it's the same people who were smoking pot before are smoking pot now, but now they're legal doing it, GDP shoots up, but they're still high just like they were when it was illegal or illegal, right? So from society's standpoint, maybe nothing changed. Now, where it gets interesting is whether making it legal encouraged that activity. And then what also gets interesting is now that it's legal, the government can tax it. And now the government has the ability to take on anti-drug campaigns and getting out to the schools to say, hey, you guys, it's legal now. I know your parents are smoking pot, but don't do it. It's going to make you dumb, especially at your age. When your mind gets above age 21, 22, statistics show that you're maybe okay. You're not going to be any dumber or smarter than you were before. But right now, at age 13, you are a freaking idiot if you smoke pot. You are going to retard the growth of your brain, right? So if we can get that message deeper into the educational system, because there's dollars to do it, from the source that's causing it, so we're going to take pot tax revenue and maybe earmark it towards that activity to educate the youth with it, maybe we've made society better with all of that jumbled up mess. But that's what we use economics to do, is to kind of break that apart for us. Okay, so illegal activities, not in there. Number 3, which kind of maybe is just a summary. Number 3 does not measure, GDP does not measure intangibles well. GDP does not measure intangibles well. What do we mean by intangibles? Well, you guys heard about the little spill that went on down in New Orleans area in the Gulf, a little bit of oil, a couple drops got dumped out there. So, was that good or bad for society? Bad. The cleanup efforts, did they tend to increase GDP or decrease GDP?
Neither, they were volunteers.
Some volunteers, but there'd also be paid workers, right? BP had to hire a whole bunch more people for the cleanup. So cleanup activities tend to lead to an increase. So the point with this, does not measure intangibles well, is that our GDP variable, as far as an indicator about the healthiness of our economy, GDP goes up, but it was due to this bad thing that happened. And so it can be counterintuitive. It's not necessarily picking up the right things that we want as an estimate of social welfare. And so these are some of the knocks against GDP and why economists have continued to explore other measures to capture social welfare too. We've never abandoned GDP, and the media is what you'll certainly hear this brought up in the media. Overall, we kind of come back to GDP thinking, you know what? That's a pretty good measure. If incomes are growing, and people can put food on the table and diapers on their babies' butts and go to school, right, because there's more income per person on average, they can make themselves better off. So there's a pretty good argument there that at the end of the day, after we have our little fights about, oh, money can't buy you happiness and all of that stuff, most of the research that economists shows is that money can kind of buy you happiness. That income is actually a pretty good estimate of some of these happiness functions that's been measured.
Does that apply to like natural disasters as well? Because I remember reading that Louisiana in
Yes.
2006 increased their GDP after Katrina.
Is that right? So I didn't even hear that directly, but yeah, you're absolutely right. That's the concept, is that workers might have stopped, right? We lost the fishing industry or whatever, but if we lost, well, let me just pick a number out of thin air here. If we lost $100 million worth of fishing activity, but the cleanup activities were $500 million, GDP went up, right? And that's what you're saying. You heard that GDP went up, and that's right.
And that also, along with that, they had people move away because they want benefits, so they started in place in other places.
Yeah, yes, and so that would be kind of maybe a separate issue from GDP. That would be a cause of social harm if we're disrupting families that have to move away from there or something, causing it to go the wrong direction.
Could the government make things like that happen on full scale just to raise the GDP?
Could the government, oh, you're getting into conspiracy theory here, it sounds like. Could the government make disasters happen just to increase GDP? I'd like to think not, but yeah, there's some fun movies and stuff that are out there about that. So I would hope that, you know, somehow some government bureaucrat didn't help the 9/11 attacks because they thought it would be good for GDP to build a new Freedom Tower and stuff. Those are really pretty far-fetched, and I'd like to think we're not there. Are there some corrupt governments around the world that do stuff like that? Yes. Not necessarily stuff, maybe equally disastrous to that, but not exactly that, but yes. So corruption is another interesting variable that economists have measured around the globe, and that tends to lead to lower GDPs per capita within the countries. That's part of what keeps poor countries poor, is corruption in the government. Chris?
Not like either with the government, like there's the analogy of like war helps the economy. I think about World War II, going to war actually raised the GDP quite a bit. So
Yeah.
Not necessarily doing like.
Yep, that's a good one to point out. Yes. Yep. So following every war during the wartime, when we were building weapons and loading up our arsenals, we see a surge. After the war is done, boom, GDP falls. So it's kind of this artificial bubble is created through the focusing our efforts on the production of weapons and other things.
Does that fall
War
cancel
related.
out?
What's that?
Does that fall cancel out whatever was raised?
Typically not. It's kind of, it depends on the war, and I haven't looked at it that closely, but ultimately it continues the upward trend. So whatever that was, I don't know, from the beginning of the war, if you map it out perfectly, things eventually come around, but there's other factors that would enter into that. Okay? Any other comments or questions? Okay, so I think we need to get into our first measure of GDP then. Let me keep that up. No, I won't. I'm not going to keep it up. You guys have it in your notes. So, at the beginning, we said that we can measure GDP through adding up people's incomes or adding up all of their spending. Adding up their income or adding their spending, which gives rise to two approaches to measuring GDP. So two approaches to measuring GDP. Number one, or the first one we're going to look at, is called the expenditure approach. The expenditure approach to measuring GDP, we simply sum up all of the spending from four types. So we're going to list each type here. Our first one is consumption spending. So consumption spending is spending by households. We're on the left side of the island. We're thinking about all of the households buying final goods and services at retail establishments. So consumption is spending by households. Not on Craigslist, but spending by households on final goods and services. What's that? So this is the biggest category. It represents about 70% of GDP. So this is the biggest category. 70% of GDP. 70% of income is this type of spending, consumption spending. And this is approximately 70%. Over time it varies. And that's why many times people get focused in on spending, which sometimes makes some economists get defensive, because hopefully, as you'll learn from this class, there's other things going on that can have equal impact. But if you turn on the news, they're just like, oh, people aren't spending enough money. People are holding back, they're not spending. Well, they're kind of caught up with this part of the equation, that a large chunk of income, of national income, of GDP, is represented by consumption. All right, number two is investment. will denote with an I. We talked about investment already. When I did the bucket theory, the stock and flow thing, the I was the purchases of new capital, new plant and equipment. So purchases of new capital. Let's put on parentheses, equipment, buildings, machines, dot, dot, dot. Our bucket of capital. Purchases of new capital by business. So now we're on the right side of the island with the businesses making purchases of capital.
I remember one guy, about consumption when you when you buy basically like things that are already existing,
Yeah.
it's not going to count into the GDP.
Right. So Todd was asking if the household is buying existing assets off of Craigslist or whatever. That's not what this is. So spending by households on final goods and services. Okay, so brand new stuff. Yes.
Just, what about like things like purchasing a home?
Okay.
Purchasing used cars. I mean, there are firms that are providing those. The money's still making the flow. Is it still part of GDP?
Yeah, so good question. So when a company buys something, when they do the accounting, the U.S. accounting, they're taking stuff off tax returns. So they are taking on what the business bought. So if the business bought a tire at Walmart for their company truck, that was a piece of capital for them. If you run to Walmart and buy a tire for your car, for your existing car, you just consumed. So the good does not define what category it is. It's who did it. So a tire can be consumption, or the tire could be a part of capital for the company truck. Let me throw one more ringer into you. Is the tire that was purchased by Ford to put on a brand new car part of this? Where does that fit in?
It's not part of the final goods.
It's not part of the final goods or service, so we're not going to count the purchase of the tire, but it would be counted as part of a purchase of the resource to go into the final good.
It's not
Right?
counted.
Right, and so we want to avoid the double counting. That's right.
So is buying a used
So
car
and let me back up a second because I don't think I was clear.
Yeah.
When you buy an intermediate good, that will not be counted over here. So it's kind of the purpose of buying the resource was to make something else. So you bought a computer so that you could design software. You bought the tire for the company truck was part of your purchases that would be expensed out there. But if it's what we call an intermediate good, it's not counted. Otherwise, we'd be double counting, which is what Todd was bringing up. If I counted the tire for the Ford here, and I counted when I sold it here, I'd count the tire twice. And so we want to avoid the double counting.
If a company buys a used piece of equipment or a building that's already standing, does it count? And at the same time, for the consumption, I think what he was trying to ask is like CarMax only sells used cars.
Right.
Does that count toward GDP?
No.
At no point.
Now, if there's a sales commission or something on that, then that'll partly flow into the income, and there'll be some adjustments for that. But you're right, used cars do not count on this because we'd be double counting. Imagine if one car is sold 5 times over the course of the year, we'd count that car 10,000, 10,000, that would count 50,000 towards GDP. So that's another double counting thing that we want to avoid.
Like off his question, let's say I have a business and I sell my business and you buy the building that my business was in.
Right.
That counts towards
Existing asset. So just the purchases of new capital will be counted. So only if it was a brand new building, if it was new construction, or it was a new tire for my company car, then that would be counted as an investment. And how we're going to keep track of that in the accounts, those of you who had maybe some accounting classes, is that businesses get to depreciate capital purchases. And so they self-select, which gives them a tax advantage. And so they will try to put whatever they can into a depreciable asset. They are not allowed to depreciate the car that for Ford that went on, the intermediate good. Okay, so then it'll be tracked differently.
So for a building account, they have to build it from the ground up.
For it to count into the new accounts, yes, for new spending, yes. Okay. Now let me add on what Jeff said here, though. It also includes purchases of brand new homes by households. So investment, this category of investment, is purchases of new capital, new machines business, and it's also, and purchases of new homes by households. That's the one special carve out. If it's a new car, it's over here. If it's a new home, we're going to treat it as the household investment, is what somebody decided to do. I think mostly because it's a big ticket item, right? The biggest purchase that most households will make would be that. But again, a used home doesn't count here, just brand new construction.
So even if the value changes, it doesn't, like, that's not monitored anywhere? Like if it's, when the house is first built, it sells for like 100,000.
It's not monitored here in these accounts. It is something. It's a variable that's tracked for sure. The value of houses over time, and yeah, all of that's kind of different stuff. It kind of plays into the wealth of the nation. So the value of the home going up over time increased your wealth. If you bought a house for $100,000 and now it's worth $500,000, and you still only have $50,000 worth of debt, your personal wealth just went up by 500 grand, right? So that's good for you, and it might be good for the nation as far as the wealth of the nation, the individual values of everything, less any obligations that we have to foreigners, is kind of the aggregate wealth of the nation. But that's different than that's a stock variable, not a flow variable. These are flows. Okay.
I don't know right there, but if government spending were to buy a house for someone, like let's say through Social Security or something, like how does that work for that person?
So it's going to fall into our next category. So he was asking about government, so let me just move on to that, and we'll see if that motivates. Our third category is government spending, G. That one's pretty self-explanatory. It's just spending by government. And so that spending would be tracked the same way as for a business. So instead of a business doing it or a household buying a home, whatever the government buys would fall into that category. Okay? And then our last category, the fourth type, is net exports. Net exports. So we talked about exports and imports last week. Exports were things that if I'm the United States, stuff I bought or sold? Sold, stuff sold to other countries. Whenever we see this net term, what does that usually mean to you? What's going on? So if I talk about your net income versus your gross income, what's gone on with the net term? Before tax, after tax, right? So your net income is your income after tax. So whenever you see the net word, it usually means that something was subtracted from the thing that follows it. And that's what's going on here. Net exports, which I'm going to put a big X for my abbreviation. Net exports X is equal to exports minus imports. What I sold to the rest of the world minus what the rest of the world bought from me. Can this be negative? Yes. Is it negative for the United States? Yes. for the most part, over the last 30, 40 years, this little variable, net exports, has been negative. So that's an important concept when we put all these things together. The expenditure approach to measuring GDP is the sum of these 4 parts. All we've done is we've categorized spending into GDP, which we will start to use the abbreviation Y, capital Y. You'll see this in the textbook too. Sometimes we'll say GDP, sometimes we'll say Y. The reason the Y is there is we call it income. GDP is really the sum of the spending as we've defined. But now we've learned in the macroeconomy, spending equals income. So we're going to use those two things interchangeably. So Y equals GDP. So we'll kind of use those as one and the same in this class. So GDP is equal to cigarettes. C plus I plus G plus X, cigarettes. Easy way for you to hopefully remember that. GDP, I've got it expressed as net exports. But you're right, if you wrote in this, then you'd kind of substitute that, which might be an exercise you'll see. It's a good thing to point out. C plus I plus G plus X, I've simply categorized spending into my major players that we reviewed here, which I didn't go into net exports. I've basically just categorized spending. What do these guys buy? Machinery, capital. What do these guys buy? Mostly final goods and services. The government, what do they buy? And then finally, what do foreigners buy from us, less what we bought from them? Or vice versa, I think it said that backwards, but net exports. So we're kind of taking into account all of our spending in its various forms: households, businesses, government, and foreigners, international trade aspect. All right? All we've done. That's a question?